And last but not least, Professor Peter Rowe, dear friend, and the Raymond Garbe Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard.
Thanks very much, Calvin. I'm going to take a cue from Gary and stay sitting. I'd like to begin where Gary started with this question of the definition of sustainability. Generally, we think of it, I think, in terms of processes for balancing human needs and for economic and social development with the need to conserve natural and built environments so that these needs can be met indefinitely. Now, this leaves a lot of wriggle room, as I think you've probably gathered from the prior speakers, with respect to balances and what exactly indefinitely might mean and how one might measure it in economic terms. But generally, this is the way we understand it. It's in terms of the 3 E's, as it's sometimes referred to: the economy, environment, and the question of equity, the distribution of that among some sort of polity. Where's China now with respect to the 3 E's? Well, for sure, on the economic front, there's been a tremendous amount of progress, as we know from the year-on-year advancements of GDP, often in double digits or near to it for long periods of time. And indeed, most of the focus of China has been on this production model, shall we say, of economic expansion. And with that, of course, has gone urban development. Dan showed some data that indicated that the urban proportion of the population in China has gone from about 17%, very little, around about 1950, to something like 43% today, on its way up to probably asymptotically around 60 to 65% by 2035 or 2050, depending on the kind of models that you look at. This means that 460 million people have become urbanites since 1950, and 80% of those, around about 330 million, since the 1980s. In other words, it's a shift of about 1 to 1.5% from rural to urban in any given year. Parenthetically, this is not unprecedented. If one thinks of the great reshuffling in the United States in the post-World War II period, or the migrations from the Mezzogiorno and other parts of Italy into the north, the normalized, that is to say per capita rates, have been much the same. The issue, though, in China is a longer sustained period and the fact that it's probably going to go on for a long time further. We expect to see about 300 million more people added to the urban populations by mid-century. The cities are dense. The kind of nominal figure that the ministry wants of construction, now of, housing and rural development, is around about 10,000 people per square kilometre. If you take the top 20 cities in China, they're a little bit higher than that. They're coming down in density to get rid of dilapidation and overcrowding and so forth. Just to benchmark that for you, Los Angeles, believe it or not, is the densest city in the United States. If you look at the thing in totality, it has a population density of about 2,700 people per square kilometre. So it's about 3 times denser across the board in China as a broader policy statement. There are kind of 2 Chinas, urbanistically. There's the glitzy places like Shanghai and the cities of the coastal region, and then the gritty, somewhat more overcrowded and dilapidated circumstances, particularly in the Rust Belt in the north. If we turn to social equity, China has amazingly lifted something like 300 million people out of poverty, even though it's still a poor country. It has a GDP per capita in a purchasing power parity form of about $7,000 per person. That's the equivalent, I looked it up, of Colombia, further south here. But to put it more in context, it's about where South Korea was around about 15 years ago. And they are now at a level of something like 22,000 dollars per capita in terms of GDP. The other thing that's going on the equity front are disturbing and rising disparities in income across the urban-rural divide. As far as the cities are concerned, a Gini index, which is a measure of inequities across populations in economic terms are relatively low. Shanghai is about 0.25, actually, if you measure it correctly. But for the nation as a whole, it's about 0.4, roughly the same as the United States, and growing larger because of this disparity between the rural population and the urban population. Access to shelter is also now coming under a certain amount of strain, although it should be remarked that China has done a remarkable thing of housing something like 300 million to 400 million urban dwellers without the prevalence of shanty slums, as one would find in other circumstances where you've had massive migrations from rural circumstances to urban circumstances. And here, I imagine, we could think of Latin America as being an example of that. And there are real issues associated with the mainstreaming of immigrants from rural circumstances into the cities. A lack of job training, a lack of adequate acquaintancy with urban circumstances and places to live and so forth. The environment, as you've sort of picked up, is probably the poorest performer of all. The long-term deferment, because of this production orientation of the economy in China, deferment of the abatement of the residual effects or pollution effects of development has been really high. The World Bank and the UN estimate it to run to something like 10% of GDP. The Chinese Academy of Sciences recently reported that it accounts for something like 4% of the annual increase in GDP. So these startling numbers in double digits, if you take about 4% of them, they lose some of their glow. There is a plethora of other statistics. We've heard a lot about air, for example, as one of the media that are being polluted. But 70% of the watersheds, according to the Ministry of Construction, now the Ministry of Housing and Rural Development, are polluted, 40% of them seriously, although there's been some improvement. 36% of urban drinking water is below standard. And I was surprised to learn from the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Construction that something like 400 cities out of a total of around 660 or so in China don't have adequate water supplies, going back to the point that Gary was talking about before. On the building front, which is much closer to my disciplinary background, there are also huge inefficiencies. There's about 15 to 20% more steel in buildings than you have in most other kinds of circumstances, 30% more water consumption per capita than even neighbours in East Asia, like, for example, Singapore or Taiwan are concerned. Recycling only accounts for about 25% of the average of developed countries. And building insulation, which would seem like a no-brainer, something like 7% of the buildings in China are adequately insulated, and less than 50% of the new ones. Sort of orientation seems to be needed here.